Thank you. And good morning again to everyone. And I think, yes, it is a wonderful day to be able to stand before you and observe International Human Rights Day. One of the things that we did at Woman Inc. quite a few years ago, of course, we've always been there for women's rights, just because of the fact that our entire founding and existence is based upon helping women who are victims of violence. But we decided about maybe 5-6 years, I don't even remember now, to put a few things that represent our organization right on top of our logo. And it says, women's rights, human rights, social justice. That's what it's all about. And really, you can't have one without the other. They're all intertwined. When I was asked to talk about engaging men and boys, I had to think first about one of our own experiences, and that was going back almost maybe 20 years ago, where we decided to do a little survey. We called it a pilot, and that survey was to determine the attitudes, the male attitudes, with regard to violence against women. And we conducted that survey over several hundred males, a few women included, but primarily males, because the idea was to determine attitudes. Because the feeling was that until we start to get a handle on male attitudes, we might not be going up the right direction with regard to changing behavior. So out of that survey, something very concerning occurred. And that was the researcher came and said, wow, one of the things that I've come up with is that men feel they have a God-given right to abuse women in terms of keeping them in their place. Now, I don't think I have to stress to anyone in this room, violence against women is in fact one of the greatest human rights abuses that occurs among our women. So, out of that concern that the researcher had put before us, men feel they have a God-given right. They have a right to abuse. They have a right to rape women even when they say no. They have a right to ignore the women who are carrying their children and sometimes even abuse them in pregnancies. So what did we do as a result? Of course, the entire findings went on and on. But it was enough out of that survey that we decided, what can we do about it? Is there anything that we can do to promote change? And how do we go about it? So what we developed was something called Men Let's Talk. It is a series of workshops, mainly, and a lot of times we do it for men. We'll call it for men only. And I think that this is a good example of how to engage men and young boys, of course. It is that we put together a series of workshops that are conducted by men for men. Because when we determined that oftentimes we're out there, just as Nicola just said, the women are out there carrying not only the burden, but carrying the word. And what's happening to the men? Many times we're out there as women, and the men really, I mean, no offense to the ones in the room, but the men really want to hear and need to hear from other men. So it is the well-thinking men and the men who are qualified and some not so qualified who are the ones that we selected to carry this forward. And we continue that program through to today. And the fact of the matter is that oftentimes when we're confronted with that program, with men, and we get the results and the reports back from the male facilitators, it is, what did Fantasia say? It's possible. It made us change from that initial finding and begin to shift to say, it is possible. It is possible to change. It's a matter of how you get the word to them. So we called our program Men Let's Talk. And we said, let's talk about gender. Who am I? Who are you? What makes us different? And as this is the agenda, we go through the process of discussing what makes men men, and what makes women women, and what makes men feel the way they do about certain things in life, including, of course, women's rights and human rights. It was interesting to see the numbers up there on the screen, which tells us a little something about where we are, men and women. 48% is a big, big number when we're talking about the lack of knowledge as it comes to human rights. We go on in our program, though, and we talk about not only what makes us different, but we talk about the 3 R's. The 3 R's, you'll like this one, Nicole. Respect, responsibilities, and rights. Those are the 3 R's that we carry forward in our Men Let's Talk. We also talk, of course, about violent behavior against women and girls, particularly rape and incest. We also talk to them about women's experience of abuse. But mind you, again, the talk is not coming to them from women. It is going to men, from men, and the discussion is all men. When we talk about women's experience of abuse, of course we talk about human rights, women's human rights. But then we take the program even further. Each of the workshops has a portion at the end where we say, let's talk about the future. What about the future? What actions can we take to make changes? What lies ahead? The next question. And then we say, what changes can you make as an individual, and what changes can you make in terms of your community activities? We know often the men are engaged in churches. I saw Pat there somewhere. Major changes in the community activities, in sports, you name it. So what do we want to do? We want to take the changes and the idea of change where the men are. But we want them to think about it, and we want them to think about their impact in a way that really creates change. So when we talk about what changes can you make, we then ask them to give us an action plan. So, when we look at sexual reproductive health and rights, that touches all of us, does it not? It touches all of us in different ways. And perhaps sometimes when we look at the many ways that are not so clear, even to men or even sometimes to women, we then take the extreme result of rape, for example. And then we look at it in terms of the outcome, which of course is spread of STDs many times, HIV, pregnancy, and when it's pregnancy, of course, there's the unexpected and unwanted children. We look and we talk to them about all of these instances. not to mention the toll that it takes when we're trying to move forward and when we're talking about sexual encounters. I looked at particular, I think this study actually might have come from the 2008 survey, where it indicated that 33% of persons between 15 and 24 in Jamaica reported having sex before 15, and the age that we can assess that they can access health care without parental consent, of course, is 18. Now, one of the other studies gave us some figures that we thought also needed to be addressed. And that is, in Jamaica, there are 16% of adolescent boys, get this, between 10 and 16 years, that did not consent to their first sexual encounter. So when someone asks me, why should we include the men and the boys in the process, I say, I think Arlene said it. It's mandatory. It is really our duty to ensure that they are included. This is a part of the process. We cannot think about one end of the equation without considering men and boys as the other half of the equation. It simply cannot work. So then when I look a little further and I looked at the sexual expectations as well as how men regarded their own health, and the fact that, yes, they were willing to talk about women's issues as it related to women, but then to get the men to talk about why they feel the way they feel and why they behave the way they behave, you start to get an idea of what it is. And it comes all the way back to how we treat our little boys and our little girls, so totally different. So when we're talking about going into the communities, we've got to talk about not only the men who can be there to mentor younger boys, which is one of the aspects of the plan, the action plan, is to bring men into the fold where they can actually mentor the younger boys. But then where do we go in terms of the community? We must go to the families. We must go to the family setting that has us, I think it was the late Barry Chavans who said, tie the heifer and loose the bull. Tie the heifer and loose the bull. It cannot work. If we're expecting that we're going to engage men and boys and to get men and boys to adopt the values that promote growth and responsibility, we must really throw that concept away. And that is the key. Now then, one of the other things that happened to us in that program, and hard for me to, I'm staying within the 10 minutes you gave me, the idea came up again in terms of engaging the men and boys. And one of the things we started to say, it's not a question of why we should engage them, but the answer is why not? Because if we don't engage the men and boys, we will only be, what? Clapping with one hand. So that in the same way, we at Woman Inc. engage men and boys in terms of the other side of the equation under the Men Let's Talk, we think that this sets a very good example of how we can promote change. A change in the values and a change in the attitude. Because until we change the attitude, we will not change the behavior. So what we want to see moving forward is an adaptation of this sample and this example. And what it is education, education, education. Promote the knowledge, give the knowledge, because we don't want to see any kind of figures like we saw on that chart. We need to move that downward until it reaches 0. We need to move that figure downward until everyone is not only aware of what the other's human rights are, but the fact that they themselves realize what their human rights might be as well. And in so doing, that they will play a contribution, a major contribution to the development of the country. We must engage them in the sexual reproductive health response when we consider everything. And we must do so when we think about the fact that without it, we will not ever reach our goals. So in closing, I say, this is but one example, but we can use men and boys, engage men and boys in certain ways that make them feel comfortable, give them the opportunity to express themselves in ways that they've never been taught before, give them the space to share their feelings, because all too often we say, oh no, men don't cry, men don't show emotion, they're too soft, whatever. We need to shift gears, and in so doing, we will engage the men and boys in a manner that becomes advantageous for all. Thank you.